Sorry, Cortez, but I need to send my best man on this, and that's you.
I should have guessed. All right. Find the crystals and destroy the lot. How hard could it be?
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So it's January 2025 as I record this, and I figured I'd start the year off with a pretty long retrospective, and one that I've been planning to do for a very long time. Long-time subscribers of mine will know that I've been talking about reviewing the TimeSplitters series for ages, and yeah, it's finally here. And again, those of you who have been following my channel for a while will know that when it comes to video game genres, first-person shooters have never really been my favourite. That's not to say that there aren't first-person shooters I like, or that there aren't some I've enjoyed over the years. For example, I really enjoyed some of the old Call of Duty games, and the original Halo trilogy, as well as some of the Duke Nukem games. I really like those. But as far as the genre itself goes, like I said, it's never been a preference of mine. Weirdly enough, my personal favourite FPS of all time is King Kong. I absolutely love that game, I think it's a masterpiece. As some of you know, I did a full walkthrough for it last year for anybody who's interested, and I'm also planning to review it sometime this year, so stay tuned for that. Of course, several of these franchises, most notably Call of Duty and Halo, are still going strong to this day, with new releases as well as remakes and reboots and things of that nature being churned out left, right and centre, almost to the point of being flat out milked if truth be told. So it's clear that these games, if marketed right, can have a serious amount of longevity. However, there was one FPS franchise that came out during the 6th generation of gaming that I was really into back in the day, that for whatever reason seemed to just disappear into obscurity one day, and these days it barely ever gets talked about anymore, and that series is of course TimeSplitters. TimeSplitters is a series of FPS games that in my personal opinion stood out as some of the most creative and innovative games ever made, with some fantastic shooting mechanics as well as a tremendous amount of replay value. They were games that had plenty to offer, with both multiplayer and single player features to keep you playing. And from what I can remember, these games were generally well received by fans and critics of the time. The series ran from the year 2000 to 2005, and to this day I can't get my head around why the series wasn't bigger, or why it ended so suddenly after the third game. Like the Fight Night series that I reviewed last month, link in description. There were quite a few rumours over the years about a fourth game being in development, likely being taken over by a new development team, and being developed for next-gen consoles at the time. However, these rumours always turned out to be just that, rumours, and at this point in time it seems like a fourth game is never going to come out. So I figured with the series being in obscurity now, and with this being a retro gaming channel, and with these full series retrospectives, reviewing multiple games in one video seeming to be quite popular with my audience, I figured now would be as good a time as ever to give the series a proper, full, in-depth retrospective. So here it is. Before I go any further, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button, since it really helps the channel, and feel free to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. Also, a bit about my own personal history with the series. So as long-time subscribers of mine will know, when I was a kid during the 6th generation of gaming, I never owned a PS2, I instead owned an Xbox. As a result of that, there was a whole bunch of awesome PS2 exclusives that I never got to experience until I became an adult. This is important because the original TimeSplitters, released in the year 2000, was a PS2 exclusive, so for obvious reasons I didn't own the game back then. In fact, my initial introduction to the series was the second game, TimeSplitters 2. Although I initially didn't own it myself, My cousin and some of my friends did, and I would often play it at their houses. I was always blown away by the overall design and atmosphere of the game, as well as the sheer amount of customization it had to offer. It was unlike any other shooter from the time. When the third game came out, known as Future Perfect, I got it as soon as I could for the Xbox, and it quickly became one of my favourite games of all time. I remember for the best part of 2 years I used to go around to my friend's house nearly every Saturday, and we played the absolute crap out of Future Perfect, and loved every minute of it. Not only did we play through the story mode multiple times on 2-player, but we also had a blast with the arcade mode, which was more extensive than any other FPS I've ever played. On a side note, Future Perfect is by far the best game in the series, but we'll talk about that later. For the purpose of this video, I went back and bought the first 2 games and replayed the entire trilogy start to finish, and here we're going to be talking about each game individually.
Hey, I'm a busy man. I ain't got all day. Let's get down to business, huh?
So as I mentioned before, the original TimeSplitters came out in the year 2000 and was developed by Free Radical Design. One thing I find quite interesting about the development of the game is that Free Radical was actually a team comprised of former Rare employees. More specifically, the team who developed the legendary GoldenEye 007 for the Nintendo 64, which, as I'm sure most of you probably know already, is one of the most well-known and well-regarded first-person shooters from the 90s. If you played the original TimeSplitters after playing GoldenEye, then you can clearly see the resemblance. In a way, I suppose you could consider this a spiritual successor to GoldenEye, at least in terms of its overall gameplay and level design. It's a very similar game. So the game is of course a first-person shooter, with it being an early launch title for the PS2. As you can imagine, the game is a bit rough around the edges, which is to be expected given the technical limitations of the time. As far as the overall gameplay goes, it's essentially split up into 3 separate modes. The game's main feature is the story mode. As far as the story itself goes, this game has a story, but it isn't really conveyed well, which is strange because the game does have quite a bit of lore, as well as some sci-fi and time travel elements. It also has quite a few wacky and original character designs. But the problem is that the game doesn't have any cutscenes or meaningful dialogue, so everything in the story just kind of happens without any context. I'm going to assume that the game was originally meant to have cutscenes, but these just weren't added due to time restraints or something like that. Thankfully this issue is rectified in both sequels, which have many cutscenes, lots of dialogue, and generally do a much better job of conveying the story, but again we'll talk about that later. For a brief summary of the game's story, it takes place along 9 fictional locations, each based on different time periods. Some of them far in the past, some of them far into the future. There are 18 playable characters in the story mode, with each level giving you 2 to choose from, usually 1 male and 1 female, though the difference between them is purely cosmetic as far as I can tell. I don't think it affects the gameplay at all. When choosing your character, they will usually have a short one-liner and character animation before you start the level.
Cheers!
Each character will have a short task for you to perform, and while attempting to perform these tasks, they will come across a hostile, alien race of mutants known as TimeSplitters. These aliens will show up and try to stop you at predetermined points in each level. That's basically it in terms of story. As I said, there really isn't any context to any of it. As far as the levels themselves go, they are admittedly a bit simplistic. You basically get dropped into a level and must traverse the level to find a particular item. En route to finding the item, you will have to fight a wave of enemies of various kinds. And this of course does its bit to showcase the game's shooting mechanics, which are pretty good for the time. The game has a pretty competent auto-aiming system, and you can fire straight from the hip with precision, kinda like the Halo games, and I don't really have any major issues in this regard. I think the shooting mechanics are solid, and despite the auto-aiming system, the game can actually be pretty challenging since enemies are also insanely accurate, and will sometimes be able to outwit you, hiding in dark corners and sniping you from long range. You will often have to take a tactful approach to these levels, since you aren't told where the target item is. and you will instead have to search the level for it, which will of course lead to you having to fight your way through it. What I like about this is that each level has its own distinct style and atmosphere based on a specific time period, and will also have its own enemy types to reflect this. For example, you have a level that takes place in 1935 in an old Egyptian tomb that's being haunted, discovered during an excavation. One will have you way in the future, in a time where robots have taken over the world, and you have to play as a robot and everything, stuck in the middle of a robot war. There's one that takes place in China where you take on the mob in a restaurant. There's one where you take on aliens in some futuristic war. There's even a level that takes place in a haunted mansion filled with zombies, where you will have to shoot their heads off in order to defeat them. And some of these enemy types are very different from each other. For example, most of the zombies will just walk right at you, absorbing the full force of your attacks, attempting to overwhelm you with melee attacks. The military type enemies will be much more sophisticated, attempting to outwit you and use tactics. The AI is surprisingly sophisticated for the time, and it really impressed me. It's very challenging, particularly on higher difficulties. Thankfully the difficulty is balanced out by levels being relatively short. As I mentioned before, you find an item hidden somewhere in the level, and you're then tasked with escaping the level by finding the exit point, which is usually located near the start of the level, but not always. Once you've found the item, however, the TimeSplitters will show up all of a sudden and start attacking you. So yeah, the game thankfully has plenty of enemy variety, with each enemy reflecting the time period of that particular level, and the overall difficulty is well balanced enough. In addition to enemy variety, it also has plenty of weapon variety, again with guns that reflect the time period that the level is based on. For example, the levels set in the past have lots of old, antiquated guns such as old pistols and shotguns and things of that nature. The modern levels have lots of machine guns, assault rifles, rocket launchers, grenade launchers, and various other more sophisticated and advanced weapons for the time. The future levels have things like ray guns, laser guns, and plasma rifles, kind of goofy sci-fi weapons like that. I really like the weapon variety the game has. Some of the guns in the game can even be dual wielded, such as Uzis or miniguns, which is pretty badass. Yeah, this game lets you dual wield a minigun. There are also throw-in weapons such as dynamite and grenades that you come across from time to time. In addition to all this, you can also find med packs hidden in predetermined locations and levels, which refill your health meter. You can also find armor sometimes, which gives you an extra layer of health. These items are few and far between however, so use them well. So yeah, that pretty much sums up the game's story mode, and as good as it all is, it's relatively simplistic. Unfortunately, due to this simplicity, there isn't really a whole lot of replay value, which is a shame, but I suppose an argument could be made that the main appeal of a game like this is its multiplayer features, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but I do think a single player campaign is important nonetheless. You can replay levels to try to improve your score, and unlock more playable characters and stuff like that, but it isn't really that fun to do so in my opinion, at least not when compared to the next two games. Oh yeah, did I mention you can unlock more playable characters for the game's arcade mode by playing through the story mode, more on that later. So yeah, that's the story mode. Again, it's pretty simplistic for the most part, and I enjoyed it. And again, I was quite impressed with the AI as well as the level design. As far as the other features go, by completing the entire story mode, you unlock a challenge mode. This gives you several new challenge levels which task you with playing as a particular character and performing a specific time-based challenge. For example, one where you go duck hunting at the docks and have to take out 100 humanoid ducks within 5 minutes. Or one where you fight a bunch of zombies and have to shoot 50 of their heads off within a time limit. These challenges are pretty difficult but not impossible, and they of course offer some new unlocks. It potentially adds a few more hours of fun to the game if nothing else. The next feature, and the one that's my personal favourite, is the arcade mode. Here you can set up your own custom battles, and this can of course be done in both multiplayer and single player, though it's probably best enjoyed in multiplayer. Here you can select any of the maps from the game's story mode and set up a custom battle. You start by choosing your map and then which battle you want to play. You can also choose the parameters for each battle, as well as any handicaps or difficulty options. This of course adds a whole bunch of customization to the game, and I really appreciate it. You can also choose which bots will be added to each match. The game gives you a whole bunch of predetermined teams to choose from, or you can simply create your own custom team, choosing any character you've unlocked from the menu. Again, you can unlock playable characters for the arcade by playing through the story mode and the challenge mode. There are quite a few wacky characters to unlock. Just like the story mode, they will sometimes have a short one-liner and a short animation where you choose to play as them. You can also choose which of them is on which team and change this at any time. You can also do the same with the weapons. Again, you can choose from the predetermined weapon sets that the game gives you, or make your own custom set, choosing each gun individually from the menu. There are loads of guns to choose from, and many of which you might have seen in the story mode. And you can play around with custom sets for as long as you like. It can be quite difficult to choose which ones you want for a battle, because there's so many. As far as the battle modes go, you have Deathmatch, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can of course take on a whole bunch of bots and either go everyone for themselves or a team match. This is the standard multiplayer mode for any FPS. You also have Bag Tag, where each player will need to grab a hold of a bag somewhere in the level, and hold onto it for as long as possible. The longer you hold onto the bag, the higher your score will be. This is a lot of fun. You also have Capture the Bag, which is again pretty self-explanatory. Each team will have a bag in their base, and the opposing team will need to capture it and bring it back to their base, while of course avoiding the enemy players who will try to recover the bag from them. Pretty basic, but still a lot of fun. There's also a mode called Knockout, which isn't present in any of the sequels. This mode is basically an alternate version of Bag Tag. It's not really much different to be honest, so I can see why they removed it in the sequels. And finally you have Escort, where one team will have to escort an NPC through a level, while the other team will attempt to execute them. Again, this is a lot of fun and it's actually quite addictive. And again, the AI from the bots in the game is very impressive. During these battles you will be able to pick up weapons from various spawn points in the map. There will also be health and armor pickups to find. So that pretty much sums up the arcade mode. And like I said before, it has a whole bunch of customization options, which of course adds greatly to the replay value. You can mess around with the arcade mode for hours, trying all these different settings and seeing which ones you prefer over others. Aside from these modes, the game also has a map maker. Here you can actually build, design and create your own levels for the game, using the tools given to you by the developer. You can craft the overall layout of your map as well as customize the style. The game allows you to preview your map at any time to see your progress. For obvious reasons, this adds hours more playtime and a whole bunch more replay value. It can be really fun to design your own maps and get a feel for the overall technicalities of the game. So yeah, that pretty much sums up the original TimeSplitters. It's a pretty ambitious game for the time, and one that you can tell was kind of a passion project for the developers. Unfortunately, the game does feel a bit unfinished to me. Again, I'm pretty certain there were supposed to be cutscenes in the story mode, and more dialogue in the levels, which would have done its bit to make the game a bit more immersive. So for me it feels like there's something missing from the game. In addition to that, there aren't many levels or maps in the game. Don't get me wrong, the ones you get are good, but I think there should have been more. I suppose you could argue that the map maker makes up for this, but the point still stands. As far as the graphics and presentation go, this game looks pretty good for an early PS2 game, but for obvious reasons it doesn't look as great as the sequels. The overall sound design is excellent, the weapons and enemies all sound great, and the game has a pretty awesome soundtrack, with music that perfectly suits the time period of each level. For example, you have scary, old horror movie type music in the mansion level. Or sci-fi-esque music in the future levels. My favourite was probably the robot level music though, that was awesome. Overall, the game's soundtrack is great. I give TimeSplitters a solid 7 out of 10. A pretty good shooter from the time, and one that I would recommend if you're curious about it, though it's admittedly inferior to its two sequels.
Roger, sir. I'm going in.
So with the first game being a fun yet somewhat incomplete experience, and one that while interesting and ambitious, didn't really stand out from the rest of the FPS genre, 2 years later in 2002, Free Radical decided to follow up on their success by releasing a sequel known simply as TimeSplitters 2, which as I mentioned before was my initial introduction to the series, and right off the bat as far as I'm concerned, TimeSplitters 2 completely blew the first game out the water in terms of quality. It's basically a better game in just about every way I can think of. Free Radical basically took everything that worked in the first game and improved and expanded upon it, which is exactly what should be done in a sequel. It's also a game that, unlike the first game, gives you a lot more context to its overall lore, which I appreciate. So just like the first game, it's a first person shooter. Also, it's once again split up into several different modes. You once again have a story mode, and it's significantly better this time. Unlike the first game, the story mode actually has cutscenes before levels, helping to give them some context. And these cutscenes look great for the most part. As far as the story itself goes, it takes place in the year 2401. Humanity is in the midst of an intergalactic war against a race of mutants known as the TimeSplitters. They were of course introduced in the first game, who are determined to wipe out humanity. With the war effort basically going tits up, and the surviving humans realising that they need to do something drastically to turn the tide, they discover that the TimeSplitters are in possession of these items called time crystals, which can be used to create time portals, allowing the user to travel to any point throughout history.
Good work. We detected a power surge on the bridge.
Looks like we're too late. You're already moving the crystals.
Cover me. I'm going in.
I like this setup since it gives the developers a good excuse for some serious creativity, designing levels in different time periods. One thing leads to another and the humans discover that the TimeSplitters are attempting to use the time crystals to alter the course of history, bringing Earth to ruins before the war even happens. This leads to Sergeant Cortez, who looks suspiciously like Vin Diesel from the movie Pitch Black, and Corporal Hart, who are the two main protagonists of the game, being sent to a space station to fight back against the Splitters and recover the time crystals. As you might expect, this doesn't go to plan, and the Splitters manage to send the crystals through a time portal, scattering them in different locations around the world, at different points in history. Sergeant Cortez will have to use the last remaining crystal to create a portal that will allow him to travel through time and hunt down all the crystals.
You go after them. I'll hold them off here. Hey,
Yeah,
good luck.
thanks.
So yeah, the plot is a fairly simple and basic sci-fi time travel story, and I don't really have any issue with it. There are a few twists and turns here and there. I also liked how each level had its own little story that Cortez gets thrown into. There's usually some sort of disaster to deal with, or some sort of tyrant or villain to bring down. The game implies that Cortez acts through the bodies of a hero from that time period, rather than himself, which I found quite interesting. Once the initial introduction is over, the story is split up into 10 separate levels. Just like the first game, each level takes place in a different time period, with time travel once again being a main aspect of the plot. Some levels take place far into the past, others far into the future, others closer to modern day, you get the picture. Another addition to levels this time is that you get a large paragraph to read that helps to give further context to the level. Another change to the story this time is that unlike the first game where every single level tasks you with simply finding an item and escaping the area, this game actually spices things up a bit by giving you a list of objectives to complete in each level. You have main objectives as well as optional ones. On higher difficulties these are mandatory, helping to add to the challenge. Of course, by completing and working your way through main objectives, the location of the level's time crystal will eventually be revealed to you, allowing you to go after it. You will usually have to complete the other objectives first to trigger this. What I like about the levels this time is that in addition to adding specific objectives, the levels are also significantly more complex than before and feel a lot less linear. It's also a lot more sophisticated in how the game prompts you to play, and levels seemingly have a lot more replay value. For example, there are levels where the game gives you a sniper rifle and other silenced guns, allowing you to sneak up on enemies and take them out silently without alerting other enemies or raising an alarm. Yet this game actually has quite a bit of stealth. Some stealth sections are mandatory and you basically fail immediately if you get caught. Others are entirely optional, with stealth basically being an optional challenge. For example, in the first level you have to infiltrate a military base in Siberia, where you need to avoid security cameras and guard patrols, taking out the radar and stuff like that. You can of course shoot out cameras and avoid their vision and all that stuff. There's also a level where you have to follow a hacker to her hideout and spy on her to learn a passcode, in order to bypass a security system. Yeah, the game has quite a few interactive items here, and you get to mess around with things such as security cameras that allow you to spy on NPCs, as well as remote turrets and stuff like that. Objectives like this help to slow down the pace of the game a bit, and make it a bit more intellectually stimulating, and I appreciate that. The game also has quite a bit of puzzle solving here and there, and levels that occasionally have some backtracking. The game may task you to destroy a particular item or bunch of items. Some of these will also be hidden in obscure locations in the level, others will simply be on the main path. You will also occasionally have to do things such as shut down security systems and activate machines and stuff like that. The levels are quite varied in that regard. As far as the overall gameplay and shooting mechanics, these are significantly better this time. The shooting feels so much smoother this time, and the controls and gameplay feel more refined. Enemy AI seems to have improved quite a bit also, and it was already very good in the first game. Enemies will once again take cover and attempt to outwit you at times, using the environment to their advantage. You can of course do the same. The aiming and sensitivity feel so much better this time, particularly with sniper rifles, of which there are several kinds in this game. Even melee attacks seem to be more useful now. I mentioned earlier how the first game had quite a bit of weapon variety, as well as enemy variety. Here you get even more. Once again, the weapons you get in each level will depend on the specific time period that the level is based on, and the ones you get here are a bit more interesting and creative. For example, in the future levels you once again get wacky sci-fi weapons, such as plasma rifles and laser guns of various kinds. Some weapons that you don't need to stop and reload, but will instead overheat. The robot war levels return here, and you get to use electrical weapons and stuff like that, as well as even more fancy futuristic guns, many of which are more effective against specific enemies. The older levels once again have more antiquated guns such as shotguns and old pistols. You even get a level that takes place in the Old West where you get to do gunslinging in an old ghost town, using revolvers and things of that nature. On a side note, the music for that level is incredible. As well as a level that takes place in 1930s Prohibition era, where you take on a mobster and all his goons, using old Tommy guns and weapons from the time. As I mentioned before, the more stealth oriented levels give you silenced pistols, sniper rifles and things of that nature. Some guns you can even add or remove the silencer at any time, which is a nice touch. The military based levels of course give you more modern pistols, pump action shotguns, machine guns and assault rifles of various kinds. Again, there are different types of these based on the era. You also get rocket launchers and even miniguns. You can also once again dual wield several guns in the game, which is badass. There's a particular horror themed level in the game where you have to fight your way through a haunted mansion of sorts that's been infested with zombies. Thankfully the zombies are a bit easier to bring down this time and they don't just keep getting back up until you remove the head like in the first game. Here you get to use old double barrel shotguns, which are very effective from close range. You get a level in Notre Dame where you take on some demonic cult. You get some of the same weapons here. There's even a level that takes place in a jungle where you get to use crossbows, old Luger pistols and things like that. You can also spice things up by using fire to damage enemies. You can light your crossbow bolts on fire, causing them to do significantly more damage. You also get plenty of throwing weapons such as grenades of various kinds, which you'll find throughout the game. There's actually so many weapons in the game that it would take me too long to go through them all. Suffice it to say there's plenty to choose from, even more so than the first game. And that's just the story mode. The arcade mode has a whole bunch more on that later. There are stages of the game where you will need to pick up a fire extinguisher to put out fires to progress in the levels, which is another addition from the first game. As far as enemy variety, as I mentioned before, you take on soldiers of various kinds, many of which will do things like take cover and try to take you out from long range. I already mentioned you take on zombies, and just like in the first game, these will walk straight at you and try to overwhelm you with melee attacks, so keep your distance and pick them off with long range if you can. In the jungle level you take on these tribal warriors who try to take you out with crossbows. You get ambushed by monkeys who are very small and annoying in this game, as well as various monsters. You have these wood golems that are vulnerable to fire, as well as these stone golems that are immune to all your attacks, and you have to instead lead them into traps. That level was probably my favourite in the story mode since it was just so unique. There are of course various different types of robots in the Robot War levels, some larger and more durable than others, and obviously you once again take on the TimeSplitters, who are the main enemy type of the series. These show up from time to time. In addition to all the main enemies, the game also has plenty of boss battles. I mentioned before how most of the levels will have a main villain of sorts. These will usually end with a boss battle against that enemy. For example, the mob boss, Big Tony, or the cult leader, Jack de la Morte. You'll also fight a guy called Kalos, who is a parody of a Bond villain.
You are in no position to bargain. They will be staying with me.
Has anyone ever told you you have a screw loose?
Yes, but in 2 minutes I will still be in one piece, unlike yourself. Goodbye.
Hey, look, we can work this out. Hey, can we talk about this?
You also take on a giant robot at one point, and even a large demon. The bosses are pretty simple if truth be told. Some of them just seem like regular enemies that have a health bar and take longer to beat, but a couple of them, namely the larger ones, are more unique. Just like the first game, by completing the story mode, you can unlock some more bots and playable characters for the arcade mode. So that basically sums up the story mode. It's a fairly interesting story for the most part, and it has plenty of level and location variety to keep it interesting, as well as weapon and enemy variety. And again, the levels themselves are more varied and more complex than the ones in the first game. Aside from the story mode, you of course once again have the challenge mode, and there are so many more challenges this time. Some of these are kind of joke challenges, and pretty much all of them are timed. For example, a couple where you're tasked to smash a certain number of windows by throwing a brick at them, as an unarmed training exercise. You also get one of these in Notre Dame where you have to use a grenade launcher. There's one where you play as a monkey and have to collect a whole bunch of bananas in the Aztec level. That one is a pain in the ass, since there is practically no room for error. Just like the first game, you have some survival horde modes where you defend a position from waves of zombies, and the longer you last, the higher your score will be. These actually remind me of the zombie feature in Call of Duty. I wonder if this was the inspiration for it. Wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, this game was also in Shaun of the Dead. Little fun fact for you. There are also several stealth challenges where you will need to sneak through a level, taking out enemies one by one silently as quickly as you can. If an enemy spots you and sounds the alarm, or you get caught on a CCTV camera, then you lose points. These are very challenging but a lot of fun. Just like with the story mode, you can once again unlock playable characters, as well as maps for the arcade mode by completing these. For each specific challenge you will get a description to read, giving it a bit of context, and you're also given a specific character to play as for these challenges. It can be fun to play through these to unlock as much content as you can. Speaking of the arcade mode, there are actually two versions of it this time. Initially, many of the playable modes in the arcade will be locked, and in order to unlock most of them you will have to first play through the Arcade League, which is a separate mode with a bunch of predetermined arcade challenges. You can unlock trophies by completing these challenges and achieving a certain score. The higher your score and the more efficiently you complete the level, the better trophy you'll unlock. The trophies are bronze, silver, gold and platinum. Achieving gold or platinum in a particular league challenge will unlock the best rewards for the arcade mode. Unlike the challenge mode, the arcade league challenges aren't actually that difficult, and you can unlock most of the content for the arcade mode, such as the characters and maps, simply by playing through the league once. Just like with each of the challenges, each arcade league battle will give you a written description beforehand, as well as a specific character to play as for it. And the challenge itself will have its own predetermined bots, weapons and parameters for the battle. And you even get a slight description before each battle helping to justify it, like in the challenge mode. As far as the arcade mode itself, it's similar to the first game, although significantly more extensive, with many more modes and maps to play around with, as well as characters. You have pretty much all the same ones from the first game, as well as a lot more. You once again set up your own battles, choosing the mode first, and you can choose whatever characters you've unlocked from the menu and set up the teams. The game gives you a bunch of predetermined sets, and you can instead set up your own custom sets, as well as choose which character you want to play as. Certain characters will even have their own perks and immunities, and you can choose to turn these off in the menu if you want to balance the game out a bit. You can also once again choose the weapons for each battle. The game once again gives you a whole bunch of weapon sets to choose from, and you can set up your own custom sets if you want to. You can also choose a time limit for each battle, as well as a maximum score and all that good stuff. Just like the first game, you can play around with this to your heart's content. As far as the modes you get, you once again get Deathmatch and Team Deathmatch, which are practically the same as before. Once again you set up a battle and try to get more kills than the other team before the time runs out. You again have Capture the Bag, where you have to infiltrate the enemy's base and take their bag back to yours and vice versa, as well as Bag Tag, where you simply hold on to it. Again, these are practically the same as before. You have Elimination. This is a mode where each player has a certain amount of lives. Each time you die, you lose a life, and if you run out of lives, you're out of the game. The last player alive is of course the winner. You have a bizarre mode called Shrink, where a player's size will depend on their rank. You have a mode called Vampire, where you have a health bar that will slowly decrease, and you increase it by taking out the other players. If you fail to take out another player in time, you die. There's a mode called Thief, where each time a player dies, they will drop a coin, and you increase your score by collecting these coins after defeating enemies. The funny thing about this is that other players can swipe these coins before you have a chance to pick them up, even if you're the one who got the kill. I found that quite interesting. You have Flame Tag, where one of the players will be on fire, and they will attempt to pass the flame onto another by running into them. You of course have to run and hide to avoid getting set alight, and if you get set alight then you'll have to chase down other players to pass it on. Likewise, there's a mode called Virus, which is quite similar to Flame Tag. Once again, a character will have the virus, which will be a green flame, and rather than pass it on to another player, they will simply have to infect all other players on the map by running into them. Once a player gets infected, they will join in and attempt to infect the rest of them. You have to run and hide and last as long as you can without getting infected. The last player without the virus will of course win the game. This mode is actually terrifying and really intense. It really gets your heart rate going, but at the same time it's very fun and addictive. I had a lot of fun with it. You have Regeneration, where health regenerates slowly, pretty self-explanatory. And you have Leech, where you drain health off your enemies by inflicting damage onto them. You have a mode called Zones where each player will score for each zone that's under your control, kinda like a command post. And you have my personal favourite, Assault. Here your team will have to capture the enemy team's base. This is a lot of fun, though it's a lot more fun in Future Perfect, but we'll get to that. Once again, the arcade mode will have several pickups for you to find in maps, such as weapons and power-ups. You get the cloak pickup for stealth, the speed pickup for running faster, and double damage for doing double damage. So yeah, that pretty much covers the arcade mode. As you can tell, it's a lot better than the first game, with so many more modes making it way more extensive. In addition to all these modes, you also once again get the map maker. Here you can design your own maps just like in the first game, and you can faff around with this for hours. You get to design the layout of the map as well as the overall style, and you can once again preview your map at any time and set up an arcade battle there. It's really fun to play around with this. As far as the graphics and presentation, this game looks incredible for 2002. The game has a very distinct style, and its visuals are really great. The cutscenes and character models all look fantastic, and the backgrounds and textures look way ahead of their time. Just like the first game, it has an amazing soundtrack, an even better one this time, with music that perfectly suits each level. Oh, and the main theme here is an absolute banger. It's so catchy. So in case you can't tell, I really like TimeSplitters 2. It's not my favourite FPS or anything like that, but it's a great game for the time nonetheless, and a significant improvement on the first game. I give the game a solid and well deserved 8 out of 10. A great experience.
Time to get out of here.
So with the first game being a fun but unfinished and slightly antiquated shooter, and the second one being a significant improvement, Free Radical had a lot to live up to for the third game. They had to make a game that was bigger and better than the first two, and with it being the final game in the series, they really needed to go out with a bang. So did they do that? Well, as I mentioned earlier in the video, yeah, they did. TimeSplitters Future Perfect is not only a significant improvement over the first two games, but in my opinion it's one of the greatest games of all time. It's certainly one of my personal favourites. In fact, more specifically, when I did my top 100 favourite video games, link in description, I think Future Perfect made it to number 35 or something like that. After playing through it again for the purpose of this review, I actually regret not putting it higher on the list, because that game is honestly criminally underrated. In fact, I'd go as far as to say it's my second favourite first-person shooter, second only to King Kong that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, I like this game a little bit more than Halo 3, which is a game I love. I think it's genuinely that great. So coming out in 2005, 3 years after the second game, Free Radical had plenty of time to take everything that worked in the first two games and improve and expand upon it, as well as to refine certain aspects of it. Just like with the first two, it's of course once again a first-person shooter. It has all the same gameplay modes as the second game. As far as the story mode this time, it's significantly better. So the game takes place almost immediately after the events of TimeSplitters 2. Once again set in the year 2401. Sergeant Cortez, who is the sole protagonist this time, is leaving the space station that was destroyed at the end of the last game.
Unidentified ship. This is Control. Please identify yourself. Over.
This is Cortez.
Sergeant Cortez. Welcome home, sir. I'll patch you through to the General. Cortez?
General, what the hell's going on down there?
It's the Splitters. We're under attack. Cortez, do you have them? Are they on board?
Yes, sir. They're right here.
You gotta bring them in, soldier.
Don't worry about me, General. I can...
Starboard turbine failure. Initiating emergency system.
After crash landing on Earth, he's greeted by two Marines who inform him that they need to escort him to the General, who has a mission for him involving a way to stop the TimeSplitters once and for all. En route to the General, they are ambushed by a group of mysterious hooded assassins who seem to come out of nowhere, as well as the TimeSplitters, who at this point in time have practically taken over the world. You get a useful tutorial here that does a perfect job at familiarising you with the game's overall premise, as well as the controls and combat. You'll learn a little bit about the different weapon types in the game. For example, the tutorial prompts you to use plasma pistols, rifles and sniper rifles, and you even get a turret section at one point. There are several of these throughout the game, and it does a great job of conveying which weapons are better for each situation. The first two games' campaigns kinda just throw you in at the deep end without much setup, whereas I felt this game had a much better tutorial that sets you up for the rest of the game well enough. Once the tutorial is over, Cortez will arrive at HQ and will be introduced to the General and his assistant Anya.
General,
Cortez, meet Anya, our chief science officer.
is that them? Beautiful. Bring them over to the machine and let's get them plugged in.
Anya and the General have a plan to prevent the creation of the TimeSplitters and stop the war before it begins. To do this, Cortez will have to travel through a time portal to track down a signature in the past thought to have been created by the TimeSplitters. You're given a device called the Temporal Uplink, which Cortez uses to not only travel through time as and when required, but also to distort time and space, allowing you to use it as a tool, adding a whole new layer to the combat. More on that later. Cortez will initially be sent back to 1924 to track down the source of the TimeSplitters. Upon discovering a mysterious time traveller on the island, the game basically becomes a cat and mouse game, with Cortez travelling to various locations and time zones across history, trying to track the time traveller down and find out how he's connected to the TimeSplitters and thwart his plans. On a side note, Cortez actually sounds a bit like Vin Diesel this time. You can't tell me that wasn't intentional.
So, been with the agency long?
Yeah. 3 years in May.
You get dental?
Yeah.
That's good.
It's actually a much more complicated and complex story than the previous two, and the writing is actually pretty clever in my opinion. You can tell there was a lot of thought and effort put into it. There are plenty of cutscenes throughout the game, and these do a great job at conveying the overall story. Speaking of cutscenes, you don't just get them before and after each level like the second game. Here you actually get quite a few cutscenes during levels, at predetermined points, and again these help to add further context to the events of the game, and I really enjoyed them. Not only is the story much more complex this time, but it's also a lot more satirical than before. This game is actually really funny. I laughed my head off the whole way through it.
Yeah! Time to split!
I'll get the next one.
When playing through levels, Anya will communicate with Cortez through his comlink, and she will often offer you advice and information about the levels, as well as hints and tips on how to complete them. She can see everything Cortez sees through his goggles, and will often comment on the events of the levels, and even her dialogue is pretty funny. She's quite a sharp-witted character.
Oh no! Zombies!
There really are zombies. Aim for their heads, Cortez.
Don't let them eat my brain!
Do you think anyone would notice?
There's a lot of dark humour in the game, and it also pokes fun at a lot of common sci-fi tropes, and gives subtle references to time travel movies and things of that nature, and pokes fun at certain aspects of them that don't make a lot of sense, but does so in a way that wasn't so egregious. There's another running gag in the game where you'll occasionally come across a random drunk guy pondering his life choices. I found that quite funny for some reason, and yeah, it happens from time to time throughout the game.
This is all that's left of my dreams. I was gonna be in a band. Gonna be famous, rich.
I wonder where it all went wrong for him.
Speaking of time travel, this is the first game in the series that actually does something interesting with the concept. Basically throughout the game during levels, Cortez will come across these wormholes that allow him to travel back in time just a short while, and when using these he will come across his past self, creating sort of a mini time paradox, helping him to progress through the levels. Cortez will even talk to himself, and again some of the dialogue here is actually pretty funny.
Hey, isn't that me?
Sure looks like it.
Yeah, that's right where I was when the other me gave me that key.
Of course, it's a wormhole. All the time travel in the area must have destabilized the time field. Your future self must have... Cortez, wait!
Psst, hey, up here. What? But you're me. I knew you'd say that. Here. A key? But what does it... You'll figure it out. Just make sure to pass it on when you're done. Ha! That was cool.
Cortez, you can't just go walking through any wormhole you come across. They're dangerous.
What are you talking about?
Cortez, anytime you interact with yourself in a time loop, you run the risk of creating a time paradox.
Don't worry, I'll be careful.
There's even sections of the game where you will have to work together with the future Cortez and the past Cortez in order to complete levels. There's kind of a running gag in the game where Cortez tries to establish a catchphrase for himself, and it causes the other characters to just cringe at it. I found that pretty funny.
Time to split.
Ouch! That's not cool, man.
Aside from this, there's also plenty of characters to interact with in the game. How this works is that in each level, Cortez will come across a character from that time period to team up with. Some of these are returning characters from previous games, such as Captain Ash.
I say, what are you doing out here, old chap?
I'm supposed to be on that island.
Are you sure, Bean? This whole area's about to be bombed to Kingdom Come.
By who?
Well, by the Navy, of course.
Harry Tipper.
Gee, I don't know, man. He just appeared a few months back, like out of nowhere. Some cult leader. Brotherhood of Ultra Science or something freaky like that.
And my personal favourite, R110, who in this game is kind of a parody of the Terminator.
Alright, Tin Man, let's go.
By your command.
Yeah, the game has this funny subplot where R110 gets a computer virus which gives him a personality and turns him into kind of a gun-toting sociopath like HK-47.
Honors and King. I feel strange. I feel good. Let's saddle up and kick some butt.
Again, some of the dialogue had me in stitches.
Jeff, there could be a human hiding in that light. I'll check it out. Nothing here.
This is one dumb robot.
There are also a few new characters introduced. The main reason for this is to accommodate multiplayer. If you play through the game on 2-player, player 1 will take control of Cortez, and player 2 will take control of the other character. I've played through the campaign on 2-player several times before, and it's a lot of fun. So yeah, the story and writing this time is great, and this of course does its bit to make you want to see it through to the end. And it also has a satisfying ending that doesn't sequel bait, which is of course a good thing since this ended up being the last game in the series, so thankfully it didn't end in an anticlimactic fashion. As far as the overall gameplay goes, it's largely the same as the second game in regards to its overall format, but there are a few significant improvements here, as well as a few new features. You basically work your way through levels, defeating enemies and completing specific objectives, en route to a specific goal the game gives you. Levels themselves are a lot more varied this time, and even come in multiple stages. As I mentioned before, this game gives you a lot more context to the overall story, and it also uses time travel a lot more. You don't just appear in random locations looking for a time crystal this time. No, instead levels feel tied together, and it makes a lot more sense why things happen. It's a more cohesive story in that sense. The shooting mechanics are also a little bit better this time. The overall aiming and sensitivity is even better, and the gunplay feels a lot more smooth. I mentioned before that the uplink adds a new layer to combat. You can use this to grab a hold of objects in the environment and use them to shield you from attacks. You can also launch these at enemies, taking them out in style. This can of course help you to preserve your ammo, and on top of all that it just looks funny, and there are some crazy ragdoll physics. You can also use the uplink to grab items in the environment that may be out of range, such as health packs and body armor. This is of course very useful for obvious reasons. Aside from all that, the uplink is also implemented into the puzzle solving and level design. You will occasionally have to use it to activate switches or lower a bridge, and stuff like that. I really like this since it helps to make levels feel more interactive. Speaking of puzzle solving, at various stages of the game you'll be prompted to solve various circuit puzzles. Again, these help to slow the game down a bit and give you something to think about. You get a time limit for these and they're usually pretty easy, though a couple of them are quite tricky. Speaking of interactivity, there are sometimes multiple ways to approach levels, which involve interacting with the environment. Certain levels will require a stealthy approach, which will be wise on harder difficulties. And to help in this regard, you can sometimes activate computers and use them to shut down security systems, such as cameras, turrets and drones that patrol the area. There are also plenty of things to mess around with on these computers. And you get plenty of files to read to further indulge yourself in the game's story. Features like this are always appreciated by me. One of the best introductions to gameplay is vehicles. At various stages in the story you will get access to a particular car that can help you get through the level quicker. These will sometimes be necessary. Some cars will have a mounted turret, and if you're playing on 2-player, then one player gets to drive and the other gets to shoot. This is a lot of fun. You can also run over enemies and stuff like that. In one of the future levels you actually get a section where you can drive a tank. That level was pretty badass. You even get to replay that section when going back in time and you operate the gun turrets instead. For some reason this reminded me of the tank level in Halo 2, which was also cool. Later in that same level you get to operate a giant mech, which is awesome. Things like this help to add some much needed replay value to the game and makes the story a blast to play. The game also does its best to spice up the gameplay by giving you varied and interesting objectives. For example, the game may prompt you to protect a particular NPC by giving them sniper support or covering them while they perform a task. You may even get to use a remote turret or something like that. The game also has plenty of level and location variety, as well as even more enemy variety than the first two games. You have some of the same style of levels as the previous two, but it's just done so much better here. For some reason levels this time feel a lot more cinematic, and there just always seems to be more going on than in the previous games. Once again, in the 2041 levels, you take on the TimeSplitters, who are considerably more threatening this time, as well as the mysterious time assassins. Most levels have you taken on soldiers of various kinds, each reflecting the time period and their overall style and weapon use. You get levels in 1960s Russia where you take on enemies with old Soviet weapons. You get a level on a train which is pretty badass. That's one of them really fast paced and hectic levels where there's a lot of urgency. You of course have the obligatory haunted mansion level where you take on zombies, ghosts, as well as a bunch of monster movie type enemies. Thankfully though, like a lot of aspects of the game's story, you actually get more context as to what's actually going on there and why the place is infested with the undead. There's basically a secret research facility under the mansion where scientists are trying to discover the secret to immortality. That level is pretty messed up too, and again there's a lot of slapstick gore and a lot of dark humour, as well as a lot of subtle horror movie references. You even get to ride a minecart at one point.
Swing the minecart left and right using the directional buttons.
Yeah, let me not start that again. You have a level in sort of a chrome-plated retro future where you have to infiltrate a robotics lab, and the place is guarded by robots of various kind. And you of course have the Robot Wars levels way into the future, where robots have taken over the world like in Terminator, and you're stuck in the middle of it all, fighting with the Resistance. All of this makes the game so varied, and it never feels repetitive. Once again, the game has plenty of weapon variety, with guns and other weapons perfectly reflecting the time period of the level. What's interesting this time is that due to the time travel aspect of the story being played with a bit more here, you will sometimes come across enemies that have weapons that don't belong in that time period, indicated that they travelled there from somewhere else. For example, in the Scotland level set in the 1920s, you come across enemies using Soviet machine guns, and the characters will remark on this. In the mansion level you once again get revolvers, double barrel shotguns and baseball bats, as well as a flamethrower at one point, and even a harpoon gun. It's wise to rely on melee attacks there because you can run out of ammo quite quickly. Yeah, the zombies will even use these weapons sometimes, which is quite weird. The future levels once again give you plasma weapons and laser guns of various kinds, and the robot levels gives you electrical weapons and stuff like that. Some you will need to use to take down an enemy's shield before taking them out with another weapon, adding a bit of strategy to the game. You also get several heavy weapons such as rocket launchers, heat seekers, flamethrowers, and of course miniguns, which are badass. And you can of course once again dual wield several weapons such as pistols and submachine guns and several others. There are also several more quirky and strange weapons such as a flare gun which sets enemies alight, and yeah, there's a lot of slapstick humour with that.
Get down!
Good shot, old man.
I don't think much of this weapon.
There's a particular stage of the game where you're in an illegal research lab and you will come across these messed up mutant science experiments, and you can use poison darts to make them explode. That was pretty gruesome. Just don't stand too close to them because you actually take damage. There's so many different weapons in the game, many of which you come across in the story and a whole bunch more exclusive to the arcade and challenge modes, some of which are unlockable. More on those later. The game also has several pretty epic boss battles, something that I think was missing from the previous two. Don't get me wrong, the second game had boss battles, but they were kind of lame by comparison. The ones in this game feel a lot more unique. For example, you take on a tank, where you have to plant explosives on it to bring it down. You take on a helicopter at one point, where you have to bring it down with a heat seeker. Kalos, who was one of the villains from the second game, who fights you this time with a jetpack. You take on the Deer Haunter, one of the most disturbing things I have ever seen in my entire life. As well as a giant thing. I don't even know how to describe that monstrosity. You fight it multiple times though. A giant battle mech, similar to the one that you pilot earlier. And several others. You even get a turret boss where you take on the TimeSplitters mothership. This reminded me of the mothership battle from Duke Nukem Forever. I wonder if this was the inspiration for that. Wouldn't surprise me. The boss battles are all pretty epic and I really enjoyed them. I never understood why so many first person shooters don't add boss battles. This is one of my issues with the Halo series. Those games had such a great, unique style, as well as some incredible lore, and there were so many cool and mysterious aspects to them, but none of them had any interesting boss battles. That never made sense to me. This game doesn't have that issue. Aside from all that, I just really found the campaign this time to be a blast. In previous games, the campaign honestly felt like a bit of an afterthought by comparison, with the multiplayer aspects of the game being the main focus. In Future Perfect, however, it felt to me like a lot more time and effort went into making a great and memorable story, with gameplay and level design that backed it up. And I would go as far as to say that this game probably has one of the best single player campaigns in any FPS I've ever played, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Oh, and it for sure has the best credits. As far as the other modes go, you once again have the challenge mode, and once again there's a whole bunch of challenges to take part in, and you will once again receive a trophy depending on your score. These are bronze, silver, gold and platinum, just like the last game, and the highest trophy you get, the more features you unlock. Features including new characters for the arcade mode, some of which are actually characters from the last game, who didn't make an appearance in the story mode, such as Corporal Hart, and a whole bunch of others. Each challenge will give you a specific character to play as, and will also give you some half-arsed backstory to justify it in the description. As far as the challenges themselves go, you once again have a bunch of zombie horde modes, which are similar to the last game, just in a different setting. You have one where you take on a bunch of undead monkeys, one where you take on undead cows, and one where you play as Cortez and don't have a gun and instead have to use the uplink to launch boxes at the zombies for an extra challenge. Again, these horde modes really reminded me of Call of Duty Zombies, which came out years later, but I digress. They also bring back the brick smashing challenges from the last game, which are kinda boring here, truth be told, but it is what it is. You get several shooting range challenges where you have to shoot a bunch of boards in order to score points. Some of the boards will gain you points, others will lose you points, so you have to have pretty quick reflexes and reaction times. Once again, the game gives you a bit of backstory for these. For example, a mental guy who thinks he's a robot for some reason and has to shoot a bunch of robot cutouts with a sniper rifle as a form of therapy. Or one where you play as Viola from the last game and shoot a bunch of cutout demons while riding a boat in Venice. Yeah, it's as weird as it sounds. These are actually quite challenging, but not too hard. One of the most bizarre challenges in the game is cat racing. You basically take control of Kalos's remote control cat from the campaign and drive it around some racetracks trying to beat your high score. This was pretty funny. There's even one where you're in a disco, the same disco from the credits, and you have to use the electro tool to charge up a bunch of robot chimps so they can keep dancing. The longer you keep them dancing, the higher your score. They also bring back the TimeSplitters story classic, and there's a bit more to it this time. There's also a really annoying one where you have to use the uplink to throw balls into these hoops, but the physics here just don't accommodate that, and I wasn't fond of it. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges to keep you occupied, and a lot of these are fun to play. And again, they unlock plenty of rewards for the arcade mode. Speaking of, you once again have the regular arcade and the arcade league. Just like the second game, the league takes all the main modes from the arcade and gives you a specific battle for each, with challenges for unlocking trophies. These are a little bit more creative than they were in the last game. Basically arcade battles where the playable characters, bots, weapons and overall parameters are chosen for you by the game, and by completing these successfully, you can unlock more content for the regular arcade. Speaking of, again, it's largely the same as the last game, but it feels a bit more refined here. You have pretty much all the same customization options, being able to choose the map, gameplay mode, as well as organise and customise the teams and weapon sets. There are even more weapons to choose from this time, as well as more bots. Once again, they all have their own one-liners if you choose to play as them, some of which are really funny.
Time to unleash the Arse-Kiculator.
The modes you have here are once again Deathmatch, Team Deathmatch, Capture the Bag, Bag Tag, Vampire, Virus. They removed Flame Tag this time, but Virus is better, so who cares. Elimination, Shrink. These are all practically the same as the last game, just a bit more refined here. One mode that improved significantly, however, is Assault. Here there are maps that seem to have been designed specifically with this mode in mind. Basically one team will try to defend a base, with walls and turrets and all sorts of defences, and the other team will try to infiltrate the base, bringing down the walls and hacking security systems and all that good stuff. This was probably my favourite aspect of the arcade mode, and I really enjoyed it. They also brought back Monkey Assistant, and yeah, these modes are all practically identical as before, you get the picture. So yeah, that basically covers the arcade, and once again you could spend hours upon hours having fun with it and customising your own battles. And it can be quite addictive to unlock all the features for it. You also once again get the map maker for designing and building your own levels. Once again, you can mess around with this to your heart's content, and preview your maps at any time. As far as the graphics and presentation go, this game looks quite a bit better than the second game, with slightly updated visuals. The character models all look great, and there are some even more wacky character designs than before. The levels themselves, as well as the multiplayer maps, look considerably more detailed this time, with seemingly a lot going on in the background. I particularly like the Scotland levels, and not just because I'm Scottish. The Haunted Mansion level is way creepier than before, and has a lot more disturbing imagery this time. I mean, you get used to opening cupboards to try and find ammo and health packs, only for yourself to open one and a zombie falls out and starts attacking you. I mean, that's terrifying, but very, very creative. And the Robot War levels this time really do feel immersive, like you've genuinely been dropped in the middle of a retro-futuristic war. They wouldn't have looked out of place in an old sci-fi movie. What helps in this regard is that just like the last two games, it also has an incredible soundtrack. The main theme is somehow even more catchy this time. My personal favourite track in the game is Scotland the Brave. Amazing music that suits the level perfectly. So that pretty much sums up my thoughts on Future Perfect. Genuinely one of the greatest first person shooters of all time. In fact, I'd say, like I said before, it's my second favourite FPS of all time, second only to King Kong. Don't get me wrong, this game is probably better than King Kong. I just happen to like that game more for my own personal reasons, and I'd say I like this one slightly more than Halo 3. So yeah, it comes in at a very close number 2, as far as FPSs are concerned for me. I give TimeSplitters Future Perfect a solid and well-deserved 9 out of 10. It's almost perfect, no pun intended. So yeah, that's the TimeSplitters trilogy, and as I mentioned before, it ended after the third game, and in my opinion it ended on a high note, which is always a good thing. I'm not sure they'll ever make a sequel, and if truth be told, I'm not too bothered either way. All I know is I had an absolute blast playing through the series. Thanks for watching guys if you made it this far. That's my first video for January and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know it was a long one and it'll keep you guys occupied, I'm sure. If this video does well in terms of its overall viewership, then I will probably have another one out soon after. If it bombs like the Fight Night video, then I might take a break from YouTube since, for obvious reasons, this video took a long time to make and I really would like it to do well. Once again, if you could hit the like button, I'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this one. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section. Stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.
Oh, Cortez. You're my hero.
I know. It's what I do.